You know, sometimes the kindest people in the world are the loneliest. And this story, the one I'm about to tell you, it changed the way I see friendship forever. It was September 2021, just a few weeks before Keanu Reeves would turn 57 years old. The world knew him as the action star, the guy who could take down entire armies on screen without breaking a sweat. But what the world didn't know, what very few people understood, was that Keanu Reeves had stopped celebrating his birthday decades ago. Not because he didn't like parties, not because he was too famous or too busy. He stopped because every September 2nd reminded him of everyone he had lost. Sandra Bullock had known Keanu for nearly 30 years by then. They met on the set of Speed back in 1994, two young actors thrown into a movie about a bus that couldn't slow down. She remembered him being quiet between takes, always reading books in the corner, always offering his chair to crew members who looked tired. She remembered thinking, even back then, that there was something different about this man, something gentle hiding beneath the surface. But their friendship didn't happen overnight. It grew slowly, the way real friendships do. A phone call here, a dinner there, years passing between conversations sometimes. Life pulled them in different directions. Sandra got married, had children, built a beautiful life in Texas. Keanu kept working, kept giving, kept moving through Hollywood like a ghost who happened to be famous. And then, in the spring of 2021, Sandra heard something that broke her heart. She was having lunch with a mutual friend, someone who had worked with Keanu on one of his recent films. They were talking about nothing important, just catching up, when the friend mentioned something almost as an afterthought. He said that Keanu had been alone on his last birthday, completely alone, that he had ordered takeout, watched an old movie by himself, and gone to bed before 10 o'clock. Sandra put down her fork. She asked the friend to repeat what he had just said. The friend looked confused, like he didn't understand why this mattered so much. He said that Keanu always spent his birthday alone, that he had done so for years, that everyone in his inner circle knew this, and nobody pushed him about it because they respected his privacy. But Sandra couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine Keanu sitting in his house, eating takeout from a plastic container, watching some old black and white film while the rest of the world kept spinning without him. She tried to imagine what it must feel like to be that loved by millions of strangers and that alone at the same time. She knew about his losses. Everyone in Hollywood knew at least the basic facts. His best friend River Phoenix gone too soon. The baby he almost had with his girlfriend Jennifer Syme, a little girl who never took her first breath. And then Jennifer herself, killed in a car accident just 18 months later. Sandra had sent flowers after each tragedy. She had written cards, made phone calls, done all the things you're supposed to do when someone's world falls apart. But sitting there in the darkness, she realized something that hit her like a punch to the chest. She had never actually been there. Not in person. Not in the way that mattered. She had sent her sympathy from a distance, the way you send thoughts and prayers to strangers on the internet. And somehow, without meaning to, she had let 30 years of friendship become 30 years of polite acquaintance. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. How had she let this happen? How had she let someone as good as Keanu drift so far to the edges of her life? The next morning, Sandra made a decision. She was going to do something about his birthday this year. Not a big Hollywood party with photographers and PR teams and fake smiles. Something real. Something that would remind Keanu Reeves that he wasn't as alone as he believed himself to be. But she had no idea where to start. She didn't know his schedule, didn't know who was currently in his life, didn't even know if he would want her to interfere with his carefully constructed solitude. The last thing she wanted was to make him uncomfortable or force him into some situation he didn't ask for. So she did something she hadn't done in years. She picked up her phone, scrolled through her contacts until she found his name, and typed out a simple message. "Hey, it's Sandra, can we talk? I've been thinking about you." She stared at those words for a long time before pressing send, and then she waited. 3 hours passed, then 6, then 12. By the time night fell again, Sandra had convinced herself that she had made a mistake, that Keanu had seen her message and decided not to respond, that their friendship, whatever remained of it, was too fragile to survive even this small attempt at reconnection. But just before midnight, her phone lit up with a response. It was only 4 words. 4 words that carried more weight than Sandra was prepared for. 4 words that would set everything in motion. I think about you too. Those 4 words kept Sandra awake that night. She read them over and over, trying to understand what they meant, trying to hear his voice behind the text. Was he lonely? Was he reaching out? Or was this just Keanu being polite, the same way he was polite to everyone who crossed his path? She decided not to overthink it. The next morning, she called him. He picked up on the third ring, and the moment she heard his voice, something in her chest loosened. It was still the same voice. A little deeper, maybe, a little more worn around the edges, but still unmistakably him. Still that quiet warmth that had made her trust him all those years ago on a movie set in Los Angeles. They talked for 3 hours that first day. Not about anything heavy, not at first. They talked about their dogs, about books they had been reading, about how strange the world had become since the pandemic started. Sandra made him laugh twice, and both times she felt like she had won some kind of invisible prize. Keanu's laugh was rare. It always had been. To hear it felt like finding something precious buried under years of dust. But eventually, the conversation drifted somewhere deeper. Sandra asked him carefully, gently, how he had been spending his time lately. Not just his days, but his life. She asked if he was happy. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. So long that Sandra thought the call might have disconnected. And then Keanu said something that she would never forget. He said that he didn't think about happiness the way other people did. He said that happiness for him wasn't a destination or a feeling you could hold on to. It was more like weather. It came and went. Sometimes you got sunshine, sometimes you got storms, and most of the time you just got clouds. The trick, he explained, was learning to appreciate the clouds, learning to find peace in the gray. Sandra didn't know how to respond to that. She wanted to argue with him, to tell him that he deserved more than gray skies and quiet acceptance, but something in his voice stopped her. There was no self-pity in his words, no bitterness. He wasn't complaining about his life. He was simply describing it, the way you might describe a house you had lived in for so long that you no longer noticed the cracks in the walls. And that somehow was even more heartbreaking. Over the next 2 weeks, they talked almost every day, sometimes for hours, sometimes just for a few minutes. Sandra started learning things about Keanu that she had never known. She learned that he still wrote poetry late at night when he couldn't sleep. She learned that he visited Jennifer's grave every year on her birthday and on the anniversary of her death. She learned that he had given away most of his earnings from the Matrix films, millions of dollars donated quietly to hospitals and cancer research, without ever telling anyone or taking credit. But the thing that struck her most was the way he talked about other people's kindness. He told her about a grip on a film set who had worked 16-hour days for weeks without complaining. He told her about a waitress in New York who had recognized him, but pretended not to, just so he could eat his meal in peace. He told her about strangers who held doors open, who smiled at him on the subway, who treated him like a human being instead of a celebrity. Every story he told was about someone else, their goodness, their sacrifice, their small acts of grace in a world that often forgot to be graceful. Sandra realized, listening to him, that Keanu had spent his entire life noticing everyone around him, studying them, appreciating them. But somewhere along the way, he had stopped believing that anyone was noticing him back. It was like he had convinced himself that he was invisible, that his presence in other people's lives was temporary and forgettable, that the love he gave would never return to him because he wasn't the kind of person who deserved that kind of love. And Sandra thought, no, that's not true, that's not even close to true. She started making calls, quiet ones, careful ones. She reached out to people who had worked with Keanu over the years, people who she knew genuinely cared about him. She contacted Carrie-Anne Moss, who had been his co-star in the Matrix films and who spoke about him with such tenderness that Sandra found herself getting emotional on the phone. She reached out to Chad Stahelski, the director of the John Wick movies, who told her that Keanu was the most generous actor he had ever worked with, always the first to arrive and the last to leave. Everyone had a story. Everyone had a moment when Keanu had done something kind, something thoughtful, something that they had never forgotten. But when Sandra asked them about his birthday, they all said the same thing. He never let anyone celebrate it. He always disappeared for a few days around that time, retreated into himself, became unreachable. They had learned to respect that boundary even if they didn't understand it. Sandra understood, though. She was beginning to understand more than she wanted to. His birthday fell on September 2nd, the same month he had lost Jennifer, the same month he had lost the daughter he never got to hold. September wasn't a time of celebration for Keanu. It was a time of remembering, a time of grief that had never fully healed, that maybe never would heal. How could she ask him to celebrate that? How could she throw him a party when the very idea of parties probably reminded him of everything he was missing? For a few days, Sandra almost gave up on the whole idea. She told herself it was too intrusive, too risky. She told herself that Keanu had made peace with his solitude and that it wasn't her place to disrupt that peace. But then something happened that changed her mind. It was late August, and they were on the phone again, talking about nothing in particular. Sandra mentioned, casually, that her son's birthday was coming up. She talked about the cake she was planning to bake, the decorations her daughter wanted to help with, the small guest list of friends and family who would gather in their backyard. Keanu went quiet, and then in a voice so soft she almost missed it, he said something that shattered her. He said, "I used to imagine what that would feel like, having people gather for you, not because you're famous, not because they want something, just because they're glad you exist." Sandra had to put her hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. He continued, almost to himself, like he had forgotten she was listening. He said that he had stopped imagining it a long time ago, that it was easier not to hope for things that weren't meant for him, that he had learned to fill his own cup, to be his own company, to need nothing from anyone. But the way he said it, the weight in his words, told Sandra everything she needed to know. Keanu Reeves had convinced himself that he didn't deserve to be celebrated. And after years of believing that lie, he had started to accept it as truth. In that moment, Sandra made a promise to herself. She was going to show him how wrong he was. She was going to gather every person who had ever been touched by his kindness, every soul who remembered his generosity, and she was going to prove to him that he mattered. Not because of his movies, not because of his fame. Because he was Keanu, and that had always been enough. She stayed up until 3 in the morning that night, writing down names, making lists, sending emails. The plan was coming together piece by piece, but she knew she was running out of time. September was only 2 weeks away, and she still had no idea how she was going to pull this off without him finding out. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have anticipated, was that someone was about to tell Keanu everything, and the secret she had worked so hard to protect was about to unravel completely. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, 8 days before Keanu's birthday. Sandra was in her kitchen, surrounded by handwritten notes and half-finished to-do lists, when her phone buzzed with a name she wasn't expecting to see. It was Keanu. She froze for a moment, her heart suddenly pounding against her ribs. Had someone told him? Had one of the dozens of people she contacted decided to spoil the surprise? She let the phone ring twice more before finally picking up, trying to keep her voice steady, trying to sound like someone who wasn't hiding anything. But the moment he spoke, she knew something was wrong. His voice was different, flat, empty in a way she hadn't heard before, not even during their heaviest conversations. He asked her very quietly if she had been talking to people about him, if she had been asking questions, if she was planning something. Sandra's stomach dropped. She considered lying, considered making up some excuse, but she had never been good at lying, especially not to people she cared about. So instead, she asked him who had told him. Keanu didn't answer the question directly. He just said that it didn't matter who told him. What mattered was that she had gone behind his back, that she had contacted people from his past without asking him first, that she had treated his privacy like something she had the right to rearrange. Sandra tried to explain. She stumbled over her words, talking too fast, saying things like, "I just wanted to do something nice," And you deserve to be celebrated, and please, Keanu, just let me explain what I was trying to do. But he wasn't listening. Or maybe he was listening, and what he heard only made things worse. He told her that he had spent years building walls around his heart. Not because he didn't want people close, but because losing people close was something he couldn't survive again. He told her that his solitude wasn't a prison. It was a fortress, and she had tried to storm it without permission, without understanding what she might destroy in the process. And then he said something that cut deeper than anything else. He said, "I thought you understood me, Sandra. I thought you were different." The line went dead. He had hung up. And Sandra stood there in her kitchen, surrounded by all her careful planning, feeling like she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. For the next 3 days, she didn't call him. She didn't text. She sat with the weight of what had happened, replaying their conversation over and over, wondering if he was right. Maybe she had overstepped. Maybe her good intentions had blinded her to what he actually needed. Maybe, in trying to help him, she had only proven that she didn't understand him at all. Her husband found her crying on the back porch one evening, staring at nothing, looking more defeated than he had ever seen her. She told him everything. The phone calls, the planning, the secret that had been discovered. She told him that she had been trying to show Keanu that he wasn't alone, and instead she had made him feel more alone than ever. Her husband listened without interrupting, and when she was finished, he asked her a simple question that changed everything. He asked, "Did you do this for him, or did you do this for yourself?" Sandra didn't answer right away. She sat with the question, really sat with it, letting it turn over in her mind like a stone in water. Had she been trying to fix Keanu? Had she been trying to rescue him from something he never asked to be rescued from? Was this whole thing just about making herself feel like a good friend, rather than actually being one? The honesty hurt, because the truth was somewhere in between. Yes, she wanted Keanu to feel loved. That part was genuine. But there was also a part of her, a small and selfish part, that wanted to be the one who saved him. The one who finally broke through. The one who proved that their friendship was deeper than 30 years of missed opportunities and long-distance phone calls. And maybe that was the problem. Maybe Keanu could sense that she was trying to fix him. And maybe that was exactly what he didn't need. Sandra spent the next 2 days rewriting everything. She canceled some of the plans she had made. She called back several of the people she had contacted and told them that the celebration might not happen after all. She stripped away all the parts that felt performative, all the elements that were more about spectacle than sincerity. And then, on the 5th day of silence, she sat down and wrote Keanu a letter. Not an email, not a text. An actual handwritten letter, the kind people used to send before the world became so fast and impatient. She wrote slowly, choosing each word with care, crossing out sentences that didn't feel honest enough, starting over twice before she got it right. She didn't apologize for wanting to celebrate him. She refused to be sorry for that. But she apologized for the way she had done it, for treating his life like a project, for assuming she knew what he needed better than he did. For forgetting that love, real love, isn't about grand gestures. It's about showing up in ways that feel safe. She wrote about their first meeting, all those years ago on the set of Speed. She wrote about the way he used to give his chair to tired crew members. She wrote about the time he brought her soup when she was sick during filming, how he had left it outside her trailer door without saying a word, how she had found it still warm with a small note that said only, "Feel better soon." She wrote about all the moments she had stored away over the years, the ones she thought she had forgotten but apparently never had. The time he defended a young actress who was being mistreated by a producer. The time he donated his entire salary bonus to the special effects team because he felt they deserved it more. The time he showed up at a stranger's wedding after meeting them briefly at a coffee shop, just because they had invited him and he didn't want to disappoint them. She wrote, "You have spent your whole life making other people feel seen. But somewhere along the way, you forgot that you deserve to be seen too." And at the end of the letter, she made him a promise. She wrote that she would respect whatever he decided. If he wanted to spend his birthday alone, she would understand. If he never wanted to speak to her again, she would accept it. But she also wrote that the door was open, that if he changed his mind, even at the last minute, even with no warning at all, she would be there. She sealed the letter, drove to the post office herself, and sent it to his address in Los Angeles. And then she waited. 2 days passed, then 3. September 1st arrived, and Sandra woke up feeling hollowed out, certain that she had lost him for good. The birthday was tomorrow. The plans she hadn't canceled were still in place, but they felt pointless now. How could she celebrate someone who didn't want to be celebrated? How could she throw a party for a man who might never speak to her again? That evening, as the sun was setting, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Keanu. She opened it with trembling hands, expecting anger, expecting finality, expecting the worst. But what she found instead was a photograph. It was a picture of her letter, spread open on what looked like a kitchen table. The handwritten pages were slightly crumpled, as if they had been read multiple times, folded and unfolded over and over again. And beneath the photograph, there was a single sentence. "No one has written me a letter in 23 years. Sandra stared at those words, trying to understand what they meant. Was he touched? Was he still angry? Was this forgiveness or just acknowledgement? Before she could respond, another message appeared. "I don't know if I'm ready to be celebrated, but I think I'm ready to stop being so alone." And then a third message, the one that made her cry. "Will you come to Los Angeles tomorrow? Not for a party, just for me." Sandra typed back one word, the only word that mattered. "Yes." She booked a flight that night, leaving at 6 in the morning. She didn't pack much. She didn't need to. Whatever was going to happen tomorrow, it wasn't about decorations or guest lists or carefully orchestrated surprises. It was about showing up, just showing up, the way she should have done years ago. But as she boarded the plane the next morning, she had no idea what was waiting for her. She had no idea that Keanu had spent the entire night awake, making a decision that would change both of their lives. And she had no idea that when she arrived at his door, she wouldn't be the only one standing there. The flight from Texas to Los Angeles takes about 3 hours. Sandra spent every minute of it staring out the window, watching the clouds drift by like slow-moving thoughts, wondering what she would find when she landed. She hadn't slept the night before. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. What did Keanu mean when he said he was ready to stop being alone? What decision had he made during those long, silent days? And who else would be standing at his door when she arrived? The plane touched down at LAX just after 9 in the morning. September 2nd, Keanu's 57th birthday. Sandra grabbed her small bag from the overhead compartment and walked through the terminal feeling like she was moving through a dream. The world around her seemed muted somehow, distant, as if everything that mattered was waiting somewhere else. She had called a car service the night before, and the driver was waiting for her outside baggage claim. He was an older man with kind eyes, and he didn't ask questions when she gave him Keanu's address. He just nodded and started driving, weaving through the Los Angeles traffic with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing this for decades. The drive took 45 minutes. Sandra spent most of it looking at her phone, reading and rereading the text messages from the night before. "I think I'm ready to stop being so alone." Those words kept echoing in her head, and each time she read them, she felt something shift in her chest. Hope, maybe, or fear. It was hard to tell the difference. When the car finally pulled up to Keanu's house, Sandra's breath caught in her throat. There were other cars parked along the street. Not many, maybe 7 or 8, but enough to make her realize that something was happening. Something she hadn't planned. Something Keanu had done himself. She thanked the driver, stepped out onto the sidewalk, and stood there for a moment, trying to steady herself. The house in front of her was modest by Hollywood standards, a simple Spanish-style home with white walls and a red tile roof, surrounded by trees that offered privacy from the outside world. It looked like a place where someone might go to hide, or to heal. Sandra walked up the stone path to the front door. Her hand was trembling as she reached for the doorbell, but before she could press it, the door swung open. And there he was. Keanu looked different than she remembered. Older, obviously, but that wasn't what struck her. It was something in his eyes. A softness that hadn't been there before, a vulnerability that he usually kept hidden behind his quiet smile. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, his hair pulled back loosely, and for a moment he just stood there looking at her like he was trying to memorize her face. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, full of everything they had said and everything they hadn't. And then, without warning, Keanu stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her. Sandra had hugged him before, many times over the years, but never like this. This was different. This was the kind of hug you give someone when you're afraid they might disappear. He held her tightly, his face pressed against her shoulder, and she could feel him shaking slightly, like he was fighting to hold something back. They stayed like that for a long time. When Keanu finally pulled away, there were tears in his eyes. He didn't try to hide them. He just looked at her and said, very quietly, "Thank you for coming." Sandra wanted to say so many things. She wanted to apologize again, to explain again, to make sure he understood how much she cared. But the words felt inadequate somehow, too small for the moment. So instead, she just nodded and followed him inside. What she saw when she entered the living room stopped her in her tracks. There were people there. Not a crowd, not a party, but a small gathering of maybe 15 or 20 people, seated on couches and chairs, speaking in low voices, holding cups of coffee and tea. Sandra recognized some of them immediately. Carrie-Anne Moss was there, sitting by the window with her husband. Chad Stahelski was leaning against the wall, talking quietly with a woman Sandra didn't recognize. There were others, too, faces she had seen in photographs but never met in person, people from different chapters of Keanu's life who had somehow all ended up in the same room. And in the corner, sitting alone with her hands folded in her lap, was an elderly woman with silver hair and gentle eyes. Sandra looked at Keanu, confused. She hadn't invited these people. She hadn't organized this gathering. The plans she had made weeks ago had been different, bigger, more elaborate. This was something else entirely. Keanu seemed to understand her confusion. He placed a hand on her shoulder and guided her toward the elderly woman in the corner. "Sandra," he said softly, "I want you to meet someone." The woman looked up as they approached. Her face was lined with age, but there was something youthful in her expression, something warm and unguarded. She smiled at Sandra like they had known each other for years. "This is Margaret," Keanu said. "She was my mother's nurse back when my mom was going through treatment. She took care of her for almost 2 years." Sandra shook the woman's hand gently, still not fully understanding what was happening. Keanu continued, his voice thick with emotion. "After my mom passed, Margaret kept checking on me. She would call every few months just to see how I was doing. She never asked for anything. She never wanted anything. She just cared." Margaret patted Keanu's arm affectionately. "He was always such a good son," she said to Sandra. "Even when he was exhausted, even when he was barely holding himself together, he never missed a visit, not once." Sandra felt her eyes filling with tears. She looked around the room at the other guests, and suddenly she understood. These weren't celebrities or industry contacts. These were the people who had been there for Keanu during his darkest moments. The ones who had shown up without cameras, without expectations, without wanting anything in return. Chad Stahelski, who had trained Keanu for years and become one of his closest friends. Carrie-Anne Moss, who had held his hand through the grueling Matrix shoots and never once complained about the long hours. A production assistant from the first John Wick film, who had brought Keanu home-cooked meals when she noticed he wasn't eating properly. A stunt coordinator who had visited him in the hospital after a serious on-set injury and stayed by his bedside until he woke up. Each person in that room had a story. Each one had been touched by Keanu's kindness and had found a way to give that kindness back. Keanu led Sandra to the center of the room where everyone could see them. He cleared his throat, and the quiet conversations faded into silence. "I need to tell you all something," he said, his voice unsteady but determined. "For a long time, I believed that I was meant to be alone. I thought that the people I loved would always leave one way or another and that it was safer to keep my distance, to protect myself." He paused, looking down at his hands. "But then Sandra wrote me a letter, and in that letter she reminded me of something I had forgotten. She reminded me that love isn't just about the people we lose. It's also about the people who stay. The ones who keep showing up year after year, even when we push them away, even when we don't deserve it. He looked up, his eyes moving around the room, landing on each face for a moment before moving to the next. "You are those people," he said. "Every single one of you, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." The room was completely silent. Sandra realized she was holding her breath. Keanu turned to her then, and she could see that he was fighting to keep his composure. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched at his sides, but there was something new in his expression, something that looked almost like peace. "Sandra," he said, "you asked me once if I was happy. I told you that happiness was like weather, something that came and went, but I was wrong." He reached out and took her hand. "Happiness isn't weather," he said. "It's a choice. And today, for the first time in longer than I can remember, I'm choosing to let myself be happy." Sandra couldn't hold back anymore. The tears spilled down her cheeks, and she pulled him into another embrace, tighter than before, holding on to him like she was afraid he might float away. Around them, the room began to stir. Someone started clapping, softly at first, then louder. Others joined in. And then, somewhere in the back, a voice started singing "Happy Birthday." It wasn't a perfect performance. The voices were uneven, some off-key, some laughing through the words. But it didn't matter. It was real. It was honest. It was everything a birthday should be. When the song ended, Keanu was smiling. Not his usual polite smile, the one he wore for press junkets and movie premieres. This was something different, something raw and genuine and almost childlike in its simplicity. For the rest of the afternoon, Sandra watched him move through the room, talking with each guest, listening to their stories, thanking them for coming. She watched him laugh more than she had ever seen him laugh before. She watched him accept hugs without stiffening, accept compliments without deflecting. And at one point, she saw him step outside onto the back porch, where a small table had been set up with a single birthday cake. It wasn't elaborate, just a simple chocolate cake with white frosting and 57 candles crowded together on top. Sandra followed him outside, and they stood together in the afternoon sunlight, looking at the cake. "You know," Keanu said quietly, "the last time someone made me a birthday cake was 1999. My mom baked it herself, even though she was already sick. Chocolate with white frosting, my favorite." Sandra looked at him, her heart aching. "How did you know?" she asked. "How did you know to invite all these people? How did you know what to do?" Keanu smiled, a sad and beautiful smile that seemed to hold decades of grief and healing all at once. "I didn't," he said. "I just started calling people, the ones who mattered, the ones who had been there when no one else was. I told them I was ready to stop hiding. And they came. They all came." He paused, looking at the candles flickering in the breeze. "I spent so many years believing that I didn't deserve this," he said. "That celebrating my life meant forgetting the people I lost, but I was wrong. Celebrating my life is how I honor them, by being here, by being present, by letting myself be loved." Sandra reached over and squeezed his hand. "Make a wish," she said. Keanu closed his eyes. For a long moment he was completely still, his face tilted toward the sun. And then he opened his eyes, leaned forward, and blew out every single candle in one breath. Sandra asked him later what he had wished for. He wouldn't tell her, of course. He said that telling would break the magic. But she saw something in his eyes when she asked, something that told her the wish had already come true. The party lasted until sunset. People shared stories, passed around photographs, laughed at old memories, and cried at others. At one point, Carrie Ann gave a toast that left everyone in tears. At another, Chad produced a bottle of expensive whiskey that he had been saving for a special occasion, and everyone raised a glass to the man who had brought them all together. When the last guest finally left, Sandra and Keanu sat together on his front porch, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. Neither of them spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. The silence was comfortable now, filled with understanding instead of distance. Finally, Keanu turned to her. "I have something for you," he said. Sandra looked at him, confused. "For me, it's your birthday." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. It was worn around the edges, as if it had been carried for years, opened and closed countless times. "This is a letter I wrote a long time ago," he he said. 1995, right after we finished filming Speed. I was going to give it to you, but I never found the right moment. And then time passed, and I convinced myself that it didn't matter anymore. Sandra took the envelope with trembling hands. She opened it carefully, unfolding the yellowed paper inside. The letter was short, just a few paragraphs written in Keanu's neat, careful handwriting. But the words inside took her breath away. He had written about meeting her on set, about how nervous he had been, how intimidated by her talent and her beauty. He had written about the moment he knew they would be friends, a small moment she had probably forgotten, when she brought him coffee one morning without him asking and told him he looked like he needed it. And at the end of the letter, he had written something that made her cry all over again. I don't know what the future holds, he had written 26 years ago. But I hope you're in it. I hope that no matter where life takes us, we find our way back to each other. Because people like you are rare, Sandra, and I don't want to spend my life forgetting how lucky I am to know you. Sandra folded the letter carefully and pressed it against her heart. Why didn't you give this to me? She whispered. Keanu shrugged, a gesture that carried decades of missed opportunities and unspoken words. I was scared, he said simply. I was always scared of getting too close, of losing someone else, of hoping for something and having it disappear. He looked at her, and in the dim light of the porch, she could see tears glistening in his eyes. But I'm not scared anymore, he said. You taught me that. You reminded me that some things are worth the risk. Sandra leaned over and rested her head on his shoulder. They sat like that for a long time, two old friends watching the stars, surrounded by the quiet hum of the city and the lingering warmth of a day neither of them would ever forget. She flew back to Texas the next morning, but things were different now. The distance that had grown between them over the years had finally closed. They talked every week after that, sometimes more. Keanu started visiting her family during the holidays, showing up with armfuls of gifts and that same shy smile he had worn on the set of Speed 3 decades earlier. And every year on September 2nd, Sandra made sure to be there. Not for a party, not for a grand gesture, just to remind him that he wasn't alone, that he never had been. Because sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't a celebration. It's simply showing up. It's saying with your presence and your time and your love that they matter. That they have always mattered. And that they always will.